In the year 326 BCE, on the banks of a river in Punjab, something unprecedented happened. An army stopped marching. Not because they were defeated, not because they couldn't fight anymore, but because they chose to mutiny against the one man they had followed across deserts and over mountains, across 3 empires and nearly 11,000 miles of territory, a man who had never lost a battle. That man was Alexander the Great. Alexander had done something no military commander had ever achieved. He had built an empire so vast, so rapidly, that it would take the world 2,000 years to fully understand what he'd accomplished. He conquered the entire Persian Empire, the largest military superpower on Earth at that time, without losing a single major battle. But on the banks of the Hyphasis River, Alexander's generals and soldiers looked at each other and said something that would echo through history. "We can't go forward. We won't go forward. And sir, with all respect, we're going home." This is the story of the moment when even the greatest conqueror in history discovered that there was one enemy he couldn't defeat, the human limit of his own men. To understand what happened on the banks of the Hyphasis River, you first have to understand who Alexander was when he arrived there. Because the man who stood before his mutinying army wasn't the same man who had started this journey 12 years earlier. Alexander was born in 356 BCE in Pella, the capital of Macedon. His father was Philip II, one of the most brilliant military strategists of the ancient world. His mother was Olympias, a woman of legendary ambition. And his tutor was Aristotle, the greatest philosopher who ever lived. From childhood, Alexander was taught one lesson: the world was meant for him to conquer. Philip had already conquered most of Greece through a combination of military genius and shrewd diplomacy. But when Philip was assassinated in 336 BC, it fell to his 20-year-old son to consolidate the empire and expand it. Alexander did something shocking. While other young kings might have consolidated power and secured their borders, Alexander did the opposite. He looked west at the vast Persian Empire that stretched from the Mediterranean Sea to the borders of India, and he decided to take it. In 334 BCE, Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the strait separating Greece from Asia Minor, with approximately 35,000 soldiers. He brought with him the phalanx, the most devastating military formation ever created. Rows of soldiers holding 18-foot pikes, moving together like one organism. The Persian Empire was shocked. The Persians had never faced an army like this. At the Battle of Granicus, the first major engagement, Alexander shattered the Persian forces. At Issus, he defeated an army of 100,000 men. At Gaugamela, he crushed the main Persian army under Darius III himself. In 4 years, Alexander had conquered the entire Persian Empire. From Greece to Egypt to Mesopotamia to the gates of India, he had done what no one thought possible. He had become the most powerful man on earth, but Alexander had never stopped moving. The soldiers who followed him had been marching and fighting almost continuously for 12 years. Young men, when they left Macedonia, now hardened veterans. They had crossed deserts. They had climbed mountains. They had lost brothers and friends in battle and from disease. They had endured heat that would have killed ordinary men. And now Alexander wanted to go further. By 326 BC, Alexander had decided his ultimate prize was India. Not just any part of India, the far side of India. He believed incorrectly, as we know now, that beyond India was the edge of the world, the great ocean, the end of all things. If he could reach it, he would have conquered everything. The first major obstacle was King Porus, who ruled the region between the Hydaspes and Aeson rivers. Porus was a formidable opponent. He commanded an army of 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. He had war elephants, massive armored creatures that had never faced Macedonian phalanx tactics before. The Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BCE was epic. Alexander, using cunning tactics, crossed the river at night upstream of Porus's position. He attacked before Porus could consolidate his forces. The battle raged for hours. Macedonian soldiers found themselves facing creatures larger than anything they had ever seen. War elephants that trampled men to death, that lifted soldiers with their trunks and smashed them into the ground. But the Macedonian phalanx held. Alexander won. Porus lost. And Alexander, impressed by Porus's courage and tactical brilliance, did something extraordinary. He made Porus his ally and appointed him as a satrap, a regional governor. This victory should have been a triumph. Instead, it was a turning point, because during this battle something shifted in the minds of Alexander's soldiers. They had beaten an elephant army. They had conquered the most powerful kingdom in India. They had beaten everything Alexander had asked them to beat. But there were rumors about what lay ahead. Beyond Porus's kingdom, near the Ganges River, lay the Nanda Empire of Magadha and the Gandharidai Empire of Bengal empires that reports claimed had armies 5 times the size of Alexander's forces, equipped with war elephants in numbers that were almost unimaginable. Alexander wanted to march east, toward the Ganges, toward these even larger empires, toward an enemy his men hadn't seen yet and already feared. The army marched east from the Hydaspes toward the Hyphasis River. As they marched, the rumors grew worse. The terrain was becoming more difficult. The supplies were running lower. Disease was spreading. Soldiers were getting sick from the unfamiliar climate, the unfamiliar diseases, and the soldiers were exhausted. By the time they reached the Hyphasis River, the army had been fighting continuously for nearly 8 years. Many soldiers had left home as young men and now found themselves thousands of kilometers from Macedonia with no end in sight. Arms and armor were wearing out. Repeated battles had drained their strength. When Alexander announced his intention to cross the Hyphasis and march toward the Ganges, expecting enthusiasm and loyalty as always, he was met with something he had never encountered in his military career: silence. Alexander called his officers together to discuss the next phase of the campaign. He had expected enthusiasm. He had expected the officers to argue for more glory, more conquest, more victory. This was what they had always done. Instead, there was profound silence. The officers looked at each other. Then one man stepped forward. His name was Coenus. Coenus was not a junior officer. He was one of Alexander's most trusted commanders. He had fought beside Alexander through every major battle. He had demonstrated courage, loyalty, and tactical brilliance. He was Macedonian nobility, a man of standing and respect. And he had been chosen by the soldiers to say what they had all come to believe. According to the ancient historian Arrian, Coenus addressed Alexander with respect, but with absolute honesty. He praised their accomplishments. He reminded Alexander of the steady loyalty of his men over the years. He spoke of victories in impossible circumstances. He acknowledged Alexander's vision and ambition, and then he told the truth. Coenus told Alexander that the soldiers longed to again see their parents, their wives and children, their homeland. But it wasn't just about homesickness. Coenus laid out the brutal mathematics of continuing. They had already campaigned for 8 years. They were facing an unknown enemy 5 times their size. They had no supplies beyond the next few weeks. Disease was spreading among the men. Armor and weapons were breaking down and couldn't be repaired. The Nanda Empire had thousands of war elephants, more than they had ever faced. Coenus explained that the Nanda army was reported to have forces vastly larger than their own, and the prospect of facing yet another massive Indian army with fresh troops seemed to the soldiers like a recipe for disaster. And then Coenus said something that would have been unthinkable to say to Alexander the Great under any other circumstances. "Sir, we will not go further. We cannot go further. And with the greatest respect, our loyalty does not extend to our own destruction." Alexander's reaction was immediate. Alexander was annoyed at Coenus's plain talking and at the lack of courage of the other leaders, and dismissed the meeting. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. In his entire career, he had never been directly disobeyed. His soldiers had followed him into the jaws of death itself. And now, on the verge of his greatest victory, they were backing down. The next day, Alexander called the officers back together, and this time he was furious. Alexander angrily declared that he was going to pursue his advance, but would not compel any Macedonian to follow him against their will. He told them that if they wanted to return home, they could do so, but they would have to tell people that they had abandoned their king in the midst of enemies. It was a threat wrapped in a challenge. Alexander was saying, "Fine, go home, but you'll be known forever as the men who abandoned Alexander the Great when victory was in sight." He was betting on shame, on loyalty, on the same characteristics that had kept his army together through 12 years of warfare. Then he did something that shocked his officers even more. Alexander withdrew to his tent and would not admit to his presence any of his companions for the whole of that day and for the next day. He was isolating himself, sulking, refusing to speak to anyone. It was a power move away of showing his displeasure, of putting emotional pressure on his officers and generals. The army waited. No one moved. No one gave orders. No one gave orders. No one said what would happen next. The entire campaign was frozen in place by the standoff between one man's ambition and an army's recognition of its own limits. And then something remarkable happened. The soldiers, understanding what was at stake, began to show their true feelings about the situation. According to the historical record, when there was profound silence through the camp, and it was clear they were annoyed with Alexander's show of temper, though not prepared to change their minds because of it, Alexander understood the situation was desperate. The officers were united. The soldiers were united. This wasn't a rebellion where a few troublemakers could be isolated and punished. This was the entire army saying no more. Alexander had to make a choice. He could execute Coenus and other officers, try to intimidate the rest into submission. But he knew this would destroy morale permanently. His army might mutiny more violently, keep marching east alone, knowing his army would either follow reluctantly or desert en masse. Or accept reality. Accept that he had reached not the edge of the world, but the edge of human capability. According to the account of Ptolemy, Alexander offered sacrifice to cross the river, hoping the gods would show him a sign to continue. But the omens were not favorable. In the ancient world, omens from sacrifices were taken very seriously. But historians believe that Alexander was looking for a way to give in without losing face. The unfavorable omens provided that way. Alexander called his officers and companions together one more time. And this time, he had a different message. Alexander declared to the army that he had decided to turn back. What happened next, according to eyewitness accounts, was extraordinary. There arose a loud shout such as you would expect from a large and joyful multitude, and many of them wept. Some drew near the royal tent and called for many blessings on Alexander, since he had allowed himself to be defeated by them and them alone. Soldiers were weeping, not from shame, but from relief, from joy. They had successfully defied the greatest conqueror in history, and he had listened. He had accepted their humanity and their limits. The irony was perfect. The soldiers thanked Alexander for allowing himself to be defeated by them and them alone. They understood that their general had shown a kind of strength that was different from conquest, the strength to listen, to accept reality, to acknowledge that there were limits even to ambition. But Alexander's return wasn't simple or peaceful. Instead of immediately sailing back to Macedon, Alexander ordered the army to march south along the Indus, securing the banks of the river as the borders of his empire. He was salvaging what he could from the situation. He was consolidating control over the territories he had already conquered, rather than admitting complete defeat. But historians believe something deeper was happening. Some historians argue that the return journey was a planning error rather than a deliberate challenge, but others believe Alexander was using the dangerous southern route through the Gedrosian desert to demonstrate that the army's strength stayed intact even without new conquests. The journey south through the Gedrosian desert was horrific. Thousands of soldiers died from heat, disease, and starvation. According to some accounts, during the return journey, Alexander became increasingly suspicious of dissent and took harsh action against perceived disloyalty. Some historians believe the Hyphasis Mutiny left a wound on Alexander that never healed. He had been defied. His dream of reaching the ends of the earth had been stopped not by an enemy, but by his own men recognizing their limits. When the army finally reached Babylon in 324 BCE, there were more mutinies. The Macedonian soldiers revolted over Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and dress and the introduction of Persian officers into Macedonian units. When 13 of the most conspicuous troublemakers were executed on Alexander's order, the remaining soldiers quickly begged forgiveness. Alexander was no longer the beloved leader who listened to his soldiers. Something had changed. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BCE, just 3 years after the Hyphasis Mutiny. He was 32 years old. Some historians believe he died of fever and infection. Others believe his early death was hastened by the psychological weight of his failed ambition. His empire fragmented immediately. Within decades of his death, it had been divided among his generals. The vast empire he had built in 13 years of conquest fell apart within 50 years. But something else happened, something more important than the empire itself. Alexander's conquests spread Greek culture, learning, and philosophy throughout Asia. Cities named Alexandria became centers of learning and art. Greek language spread. Greek philosophy reached India. The Greek way of thinking spread to the corners of the known world. By turning back from further eastward expansion, Alexander solidified control over existing territories while laying the groundwork for Hellenization in those areas. This shift from aggressive conquest to governance and integration of diverse cultures would have lasting implications for both local societies and future imperial strategies. But the real legacy of the Hyphasis Mutiny was something different. It was proof that even the greatest leader couldn't force his people beyond their human limits. That loyalty had boundaries. That soldiers' men who had given everything had the right to say no more. In a world where leaders often demanded absolute obedience, where questioning authority was often punishable by death, Alexander's army did something remarkable. They spoke the truth, and their king listened. Alexander the Great conquered the known world. He defeated every military superpower on earth. He was beaten in no battles. But on the banks of the Hyphasis River, he was defeated not by an enemy, but by the realization that there were limits to conquest, to ambition, to what human beings could endure. The mutiny ended with Alexander giving in to his men's wishes and turning back. He did not venture further into the Indian subcontinent as he intended. Over the years, historians have examined the importance of this moment of tension between a king and his army. What the soldiers who stood on that riverbank understood, what Coenus understood, was that being a leader sometimes means not just inspiring people to do impossible things, but recognizing when the impossible has been done and when it's time to go home. The Hyphasis River marks the easternmost extent of Alexander's conquests, not because he was defeated in battle, but because his men chose to stop, and in stopping, they changed the course of history.